All right, so a quick recap. Yesterday and in the last two sessions, in fact, what we focused on was paying attention to types and profiles of different academic institutions in the United States that employ faculty. Having knowledge of the faculty search job search timeline, as well as the platforms where you can look out for open positions. Making, putting some effort into cultivating professional community before you enter the job market to kind of learn about the hiring landscape, but also get help and support on review of materials and your communication strategy. Yesterday, we spent some time on looking at the potential narratives that job descriptions and ads have when posting for faculty jobs, and how to use that narrative to tailor your CV and cover letter to the statements that and expectations presented in a job ad. Finally, we discussed the different components of the applications and how the connecting pieces go together towards presenting a holistic academic story. Today, we are going to take it further and in the same fashion, talk about the components of the academic interview process and the goals for each step. And how you are going to then present your best strategies forward to prepare and plan for the interview. All before having strategies for before interview, during interview, and after interview. Also being mindful towards having, like we talked about yesterday, effective and consistent communication strategy to convey during the interview your fitness and collegiality. And this goes back to the ACRA rubric that we talked about in level 1. And finally, we'll spend some time and the last part of today's talk on looking at some components of a job offer and what you would require to not just, thrive, but succeed in your faculty appointment in an institution, and how you could leverage some management strategies towards negotiating for those in your position. So in a quick, recap, we look at just generally the academic interview process by itself, then go into specific strategies to prepare for them, and then, move forward towards the negotiation elements and strategies. So let's put it out there first, right? Like yesterday I said, what was the goal of a good application? The goal for a good application was to get that interview. Right? And so now what is the goal for the interview? If the employer has already called you for an interview, they most likely believe that you are qualified for the job. What they want to see is more about you, learn a little bit more about you to see that fitness and collegiality aspect, how you would be as a departmental colleague. Right? And so what I want to kind of convey here is a lot of, us as candidates for whatever job interview we go for, we spend too much time trying to convince people that we are qualified for something. But I would like to kind of get your attention to kind of thinking about what Rachel Lettery talked about in her talk. Enjoy the process. Use the process in not just conveying that you would be the best candidate, but also learning about the culture and the environment of the institute and evaluating whether you would actually succeed and thrive, because your journey doesn't end with the job offer. Your journey begins with the job offer. So this is the interview process is when you actually reflect on how you would thrive in an environment. Would you be successful in that environment? So keep an open eye, look at the interview process more as a journey. And enjoy every aspect of it and keep open mind and learn more from it as much as you can. That said, I really like the 7 P's in terms of just having some agency of the process. Where do you have power and direction and ownership of the process is in being really prepared for it, knowing what to expect as much as you can, being prepared, being punctual, having a strategy for communication, putting your best self forward, being professional and polite, whatever that means in your context, right? And finally, I want to put a little more of a plug for the last P, which is persuasive. So, not just focusing too much on persuasion, but also not thinking of that as a bragging or arrogance, like having that balance in being a persuasive candidate that you have, which comes from confidence. I feel like you should feel confident when you are going into an interview. So revisiting the timeline that we talked about, typically speaking, the early fall is when the applications, the job postings come out and applications happen. By late fall or even winter is when the rounds of interviews happen. I know one of you have already started interviewing, so which means, but basically this is a typical timeline, but it might vary in different cycles. This year it's probably all over the place. And in generally early spring is when you can expect the quote unquote on-campus interviews, which might happen on partly on Zoom this year in this round, and we'll see how it goes for 2021, 2022. By the end of spring is when the chairs and the committee make a decision on who they are going to extend the job offers to. With the intention that you will spend some time over spring and summer negotiating and going back and forth and finalizing the offer so that there is enough time for the faculty to onboard and start in early fall, especially if they're going to start right away in terms of research and or teaching. So when we are approaching the interview stages, it's advisable to kind of, in terms of preparation, break it up in 3 different parts: before, during, and after, and having a strategy for how you're going to approach each phase of the interview and what are some things to look out for. So in the next few slides, I'll go through each of those and the different parts of the interview and how to think about them. So let's take at the first interview. Generally speaking, the first the first 2 rounds of screening interviews would be on the phone or via Zoom, and those are shorter. Here the goal or the intention really is the hiring committee really liked your credentials on paper. They want to kind of hear from you and see if you are just as exciting or come across as consistent in person as you have on paper. Here, these are shorter interviews, so your strategy should be that you should be more specific and concise in your communication, but shouldn't feel the need to tell them everything about yourself. Give them enough nuggets that would get them excited to get you for an in-person interview or a campus interview. And so how do you do that? One way is to think about, look at the job descriptions, remind yourself what their priorities are. The second is also go back to the ACRA rubrics and see what they are probably, really looking for in those aspects, and trying to make sure you prioritize those elements, and especially be responsive to the questions they're asking. They don't deviate from that question. If they're asking you about research independence or research vision, stick to that. Don't go from to other directions, because it's a shorter interview and they're specifically asking you about different things just to evaluate their interest in moving forward. So that said, before, some of the things that you would be doing is, research, which we've been talking about since level 1. And if you've consistently been doing research on the institution and or the department before you started your job search process, or even during your application process, you already probably have a lot of the information in terms of their structure and culture and stuff like that. Few things to really ask for. Generally, you are provided with these details. If not, it's very reasonable to ask for it. Is the members of the search committee, or who would be the interviewers in each round. When you get that information, look them up, know where they're coming from, and prepare responses which are more catered towards just preempting what they might be asking you for. No matter what interview, whether it's screening interview, in campus, make sure you have a list of questions of your own to ask. And here I have also posted an article from the resources we collected at UVA towards commonly asked good questions at different rounds of interviews. But also look at all the questions I asked the faculty during the 2.1 rounds, right? So those could also provide some specific contextual questions for your situation. If it's on Zoom and stuff, it goes without saying, especially in today's time, make sure that your technology works, go to an environment where internet is more secure, and, practice it with a friend or a colleague. Make sure, your lighting is all right, pick a place which works really well, stuff like that. And, about the professional etiquette sort of stuff. I'm happy to talk more about it for anyone who wants to schedule an individual conversation about that. Okay, and so now if we move on to the during phase of the screening interview, the search committee would generally introduce themselves. These can last about less than an hour generally. Anything between 20 minutes to 45 minutes based on whether it's on the phone or Zoom. Sometimes I've heard some colleagues who've said screening interviews that lasted 2 hours, but I don't hear more than that. Happy to hear if anybody had other experiences. So what they are going to do is introduce themselves and the position once again to kind of lay out the expectations, and they'll ask you about basic questions about your research vision, your teaching philosophy. This is very important that when you, especially if you have made 15 different applications, in terms of preparing, make sure you know at the back of your mind very well what your application to this university said. In your research statement, in your teaching statement, in your CV, in your cover letter. Here they're looking for consistency. Make sure you're saying the same things or very similar things when you are talking about basic questions about research and teaching. And finally, the third one that consistently will keep coming up during the interview is how you see yourself fit into that institution. This will, after both screening interviews as well as the in-person interviews, make it a habit to thank each committee member, or minimally at least the committee chair. Throughout the process, express enthusiasm and curiosity. And as best as you can, find the alignment and highlight it. And so if you've done your homework from the beginning, where you were researching yourself and your values, it'll come easier to demonstrate that. All right, so the next part I want to highlight about the on-campus interview portion. Similar to what I just said, similar to the screening interviews, you want to also, brush up on your research on the institution, on the department, on the culture of research and teaching at the department as well as the institution. That's the stage one. So going into details about it, we've looked into this a little bit in the 3.1 session on, going into the college navigator system, but also looking at other elements. So, definitely look up everything that's on their website. Some things to be mindful of are their mission and goal of the university itself. What is the organizational structure and key leaders? For example, UVA is a decentralized system. There are different schools. There's a president, provost, and each school has its own dean and department head and chair, right? And so you need to be cognizant of what kind of university system you're walking into and what is the organizational leadership structure look like. If you're interviewing in multiple places along the way, you kind of have to have a comparison analysis of strengths and weaknesses of each of those institutions. In terms of Carnegie classifications or other rankings of the specific department or the research field that you're looking at, where do each of those fall? In getting into the department itself, this is where you need to think more in terms of culture. What is the history of the department? How old is this? Who are the faculty members? What are generally broad areas of research and scholarly interests in those? Who were the recent hires, which would be a reflection and indication towards the future direction of research for those departments and affiliated departments, as well as having an eye towards what are the facilities and resources at the university to support research as well as teaching capabilities of faculty. If you have looked these up before, you will actually have more of an intentional conversation during your interview, and you can show that you've done your homework. Finally, in terms of community, you want to look at also, similar to that, interdisciplinary places, study abroad programs, and institutional collaborations. You also might want to look at their news, just, Google it, or look at, say, for example, UVA Today, to kind of look at what in the last few months UVA has been talked about. The second stage is preparing for the interview itself after you've done your broad research. And so this is when the itinerary becomes really important, to have a specific understanding of what those days, sometimes it's multiple days, right, will look like. It's generally a mix of formal and informal interactions. You would, at consistently through all of those formal and informal interactions, be practicing different modes of communicating your research, whether it's short or long, whether it's a formal presentation or just having a conversation. For each of those, you have to be mindful towards what the goal of communication is. Are you communicating with somebody who you want to develop an active collaboration with? Are you communicating with somebody just to kind of show what your interests are and for them to evaluate how you would fit into the department? So being able to kind of think through each of those elements before, while you prepare, would serve you well. So similar to Rachel's talk, where she kind of gave a quick snapshot of what the day could look like. Typically in a lot of the STEM fields, they are distributed in 2 different days. Most of them are a mix of informal interaction, starting with sometimes breakfast. So this could be, the first and the last thing you do are generally meeting with the hiring committee or the chair. Generally, the last conversations are with the chair, where you get more of an expectation, of laying out what the next steps might be, stuff like that. In the beginning, those 2 conversations, although you might be really nervous at the beginning and very tired by the end, be extra take extra preparation to present your best self, because of the first and the last impression that people talk about. Be very careful about presenting the best version of yourself in those settings. And so in the middle too, you would look at multiple different meetings where you meet with potential colleagues, as well as students and postdocs, for example, other administrative faculty in the department. Mixed in the middle might be formal job talks, right? Job talks, chalk talks, teaching demonstration based on what kind of university you're going into and what the focus of the role is. You would have to kind of present what kind of teacher and researcher you would be to your colleagues and students. And so, like I said, interactions and meetings would be a series of conversation where, again, the goal is you have to rehearse your academic capital in terms of telling them where you stand in terms of skills, experiences, and what your research intellectual curiosity leads towards. Communicating your accomplishments and plans as it relates to teaching and research with interest and enthusiasm. Knowing in advance what points you want to make to convey your fitness within the position and to whom. And if you have thought through really well, you know what to tell the chair versus what to actually tell or ask specific questions of your colleagues. And so, this is really important. The last 2 points goes back to the agency and ownership of the process. Do not depend on your interviewers to draw out the relevant points you're trying to make. Be very strategic and intentional with and take ownership of the process and lead the process. That way, that would also help you not feel stressed out about it, and will make you feel a little more confident and powerful about this process. Ultimately, what they really want to know, and this is if you have to remember one slide, remember this slide. To all stages of your interview, what they really want to know is, A, you are going to be a quick starter who will adapt to the environment well and get started with your research and teaching goals really fast. You will be consistently a good departmental citizen. You would be collaborative, you would support your colleagues, and your research and teaching would be a good fit and complement the mission of the department and the institute in general. Final attention is making sure that while you are preparing for how to present yourself, you also put really good thought on coming up with questions for individual meetings. And this will also require tailoring to the itinerary. Like, what kind of questions would you ask the chair? What kind of questions would you ask somebody who you want to collaborate with? What about somebody who doesn't work in your specific domain of research, but just wants to kind of get to know you as a colleague? What questions would you ask them? What would you ask the faculty member who were recently hired? So think about different kind of like questions you would ask each of those interactive meetings. All right, so now I want to spend a little more time towards thinking through the communicating your research part. And you've already taken a stab at it through your the first session in the level 3, where we talked about communicating a research pitch, right? This is really important during the interview part, because through your informal and formal communications, you will be talking to people who either know really a lot about your specific research or not so much about your specific research. So you need to have different versions of a research pitch, whether it's a 1-minute version, a 3-minute version, or a little longer, to engage with audiences who come from diverse level of understanding of your research vision. And be very well prepared with these, because at some point when you're going through 2 days of this, you will be so tired that if you haven't well memorized different versions and prepared with it, that it should come and roll out of your tongue even when you're not actively thinking, or you don't have the capacity to actively think about it. And so make sure, if you are going to spend a lot of time, spend it on this. Really be well prepared with different versions of your research pitch. And I won't go into the details of the formal talk. Rachel's slides do a really good job in explaining how to strategize based on that. If we look at the different ways of interviewing, majority of the formal and informal conversations that you would have one-on-one will involve some level of assessing whether you are a quick starter, a good departmental citizen, and how your research complements with the department through behavioral interview questions. And so what really those are is basically trying to find out what kind of human being and colleague you would be beyond what you have already kind of communicated on paper. And so the best way to kind of do concise storytelling during behavioral interview portion is trying to adapt the STAR framework. And this works really well for both academic and non-academic interviews. The STAR framework generally is a pretty typical storytelling framework that we also use in writing our academic papers and stuff, where STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. Where situation is setting the stage. So in terms of your scientific paper, this would be the background, right, or introduction. Task is introducing the goal, challenge, or question. So this is where you talk about your research question. Your action would be, methods and how did you approach the research questions. And the result is what results and outcomes you had from it. And reflection is the additional R that you can introduce in that. And similar to the discussion portion of your paper, what did you learn from this experience, and how has that sort of shaped your vision and thought towards how you apply it to your professional life? All right, so let's test this principle through an example. If somebody asked you, what is your mentoring style? The text, the subtext here is they might want to really know, how would you manage your students in the lab and or in the classroom? So the best way that I have thought about kind of, answering that is thinking about your experiences, your past experiences, giving one specific concise example which fits the STAR framework. And the reflection could also kind of guide you in learning what your philosophy is. And so I generally start with the reflection to kind of start broad and then go into the example. So for example, if somebody asks me what my mentoring style is, I would say my mentoring style depends on the goal and the person that I'm dealing with, much like my research project. Let me give you an example. A postdoc in my graduate lab was finishing up and was delegating some of their mentoring responsibilities. So I had to take up the mentoring, and a smart but generally specifically difficult undergraduate student who had problems with authority. And the postdoc was struggling with mentoring that student. What I did was I used my research skills into application, observed what the issue was, that the issue really was lack of trust. And so that's what I had to build with this undergraduate student. So what I did was let her kind of use her judgment on a lot of the research design. If there were any mistakes or she was not getting the experimental results that she was hoping, I would work with her in understanding where the design was probably needed a little more tweaking and help her. This really well helped over time in building the trust and respect I had with the student. And as a result, we had a pretty productive 2-year collaboration. She went on to publish a paper with me and was the second author of my paper, and also ended up like mentoring other undergraduate students and spearheaded a small project under my dissertation. So small story kind of tells you, distilled through one example, how I tackled one situation, and gives you a glimpse of what my mentoring style should be, especially in the research context, right? So let's take a couple minutes, not couple minutes, take 5 minutes to build your star story. Go with one of these questions. If somebody asks you what was your best research, teaching, or mentoring moment, just pick one. What was your best research moment? Build a star story. Write one up on a sheet of paper, and then we'll break up into breakout groups where you would test it, your star story, with 2 others, where they would play the role of an interviewer and you tell your star story and get feedback from them. So we'll spend a total of 15 minutes. Please stop recording if you want to start recording again. So like I said, I'm not going to go into vast amounts of details on the formal presentations, especially Job Talk and Chalk Talk, because Rachel did a great job with her session and her slides are available. Couple things I do want to point out, because we didn't get the opportunity to go into that with her session, is reminding you first, right? Like, just in terms of strategizing your presentation, some things you want to know beforehand is who you are talking to, right? Like if it's your teaching demonstration, what class is it? Is it an undergraduate class? What level of prior knowledge they have? What size of audience are you going to speak to, and who are going to be in the room, generally speaking? And these are questions you can ask the program coordinator or whoever is in touch with you from the department who is setting up your agenda. Second is, how long you have should be pretty legible on the itinerary. But if you want, you have to be really careful about when you are thinking about your content, what should you cover? And I have to make a special plug about this, especially on Zoom, because if you have seen how regimental E and I are with our, workshops and presentations we do on Zoom, let me tell you that we account for every minute. We time every portion of our talks and coordinate with each other about whether we are going on time or not. That's why creating that session plan really helps to make sure how much content I'm going to be reasonably covering and whether the timing fits well or not. So all that to say that if you are going to present on Zoom, take extra precaution and prepare a little bit more to make sure that you are keeping time and a reasonable pace throughout your talk. Okay, how are you going to talk about, and what would be your sort of engagement style? Think that through as well. Some of us like to do improv, and I fall in that category as well, but especially in this environment, Zoom is not my strength. It's new for everyone. Putting a little bit of thought beforehand in how you are going to show enthusiasm, show a little more well-roundedness to yourself, and how you're going to engage with your audience, whether it's verbally or on Zoom, like just checking in with people, getting their thoughts and stuff like that. Are you allocating time for that? And find out where, right? Like, where are you going to do, how are you going to present it? What kind of technology is going to be available to you? If it's in person, what size of room are you going to get into? The more details you can get is easier. If it's one of those like tiered lecture rooms, you might want to be prepared for that, right? Like, you don't want to be surprised going into a whole theater looking room and thinking about, oh my God, what am I going to do now? All right, so the other sort of thing that I want to pay a little more time towards is dealing with hecklers. This is going to happen, especially if you're giving a research talk, right? There would be people who would be constantly questioning you and getting into too many details that you don't want to really address within a diverse crowd. And so how do you, and this goes into the diplomatic management, bucket of things. First of all, it's always good to be aware about the flaws, and I don't want to use the term weakness as much as where you don't have conclusive data or where there might be questions coming in your research plan. What are some of the points that they are going to really get into? And this is, think about your committee meetings, think about every time you've presented your paper, and so one good suggestion here is try to do practice your talk multiple times with different departmental colleagues, maybe from people who are outside your research field as well, to see what kind of questions come up, so what are your holes in your argument. Complement their insight, always start with thanking them. But if they get into too many details, that's eating up the time from you are in the leadership position here. You are controlling the crowd and the talk. So you can always say, I really appreciate this, but I think for the interest of time, let's talk after the seminar so that I would do a better job explaining to you. Let me just give a short synopsis right now, but we can carry this conversation after my talk. And if you end up meeting with that person in a one-on-one meeting, maybe continue the conversation there. Maybe they are coming from a really curious place where they want to think about exploring a collaboration. So keep an open mind, and just make them feel special and try to see where they're coming from. But also, this is an important point to make, especially with scientists. We are sometimes not sure about standing our ground, right? Like, it's one thing to be humble, but also don't just give away. Sometimes they're testing you on your conviction towards your argument, right? Like, so if you feel strongly about something, there are polite ways and diplomatically you can stand your ground, saying, I really appreciate that thought, and but let me show you some evidence. And this is where extra slides help. Saying, I actually looked into that and I have background slides. Let's talk about it later. I would love to show you some other data that we have. Also, especially for our international postdocs in the crowd, be aware for the equal employment opportunity policies of universities and what questions are outright not legal to ask or fall into the gray zone of inappropriate, right? When it comes to, it's pretty reasonable to say, when it comes to any sort of demographic and identity, it's not reasonable to ask those questions. However, context matters. If you are having an individual conversation with a potential colleague, and you're having a conversation on, say, childcare, and they might just generally throw in a question about, I don't know if you are planning to be a parent or you are a parent, but it's happening in the context of a childcare discussion, it's fine. They're not trying to really probe into your identity a little more. This is in context of conversation that would make sense for. So you have to evaluate a little bit about where you are, comfortable responding or where you are not. It's okay to be generous about thinking about somebody else's intent, but you can always stand your ground by saying, I really appreciate you asking me that, but I'm not comfortable talking about it. This is also a very sort of irregular thing. It doesn't happen typically in a interview stage where they talk about your salary expectations, but sometimes they might. All right, I just read that comment. I'll get back to it. That, in terms of childcare and having kids, whether that's a reasonable question to come up or not. Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable question, but like our commenter tells us in the chat, just be prepared for unexpected surprises to come up in the interview. And that's also an interesting point to kind of also assess the departmental climate, right? Like, if it's a passing comment that one faculty member made, it's fine. But if it's constantly coming from the chair, then you might want to keep a note of that when you're doing your comparison and analysis of departmental climate and culture, what conversations you had at one of these places. All right, so like I said, it's not typical for the chair or the hiring committee to ask you about salary expectations. However, if this ever comes up, it's always good to be prepared to know how to address this. So always state that you would rather discuss after you have a better sense of, whether you are a good fit for this position and you complement the department's, expectations and needs. And you want to, whether you want to learn a little bit more about the diverse responsibilities, especially, in terms of collaboration and research. Your expectations are not just based on one thing, but they are dependent on a lot of different things, including the startup package, including other aspects that we'll get into, benefits, students, etc. If they do persist, you can give an appropriate range. And this is when the taking time to actually think ahead of time about your salary and budget for startup, etc., might be a good strategy. The article that I posted, all the articles that I posted under the negotiation are really good. Especially I want to call out the one from UCSF. They have broken it down in terms of what are reasonable salary ranges for what kind of disciplines and what kind of cities. It's a few years old, but at least it will give you the understanding. Before leaving for the interview, make sure you thank, like I said, the last conversation you have is probably going to be with the chair or, the hiring committee. And so thank everyone for their time and consideration. With your last conversation with the chair, it's always a good thing to ask about the next steps and expected timeline so that you know what to expect, especially if you are interviewing in multiple places. You would kind of, having the knowledge of that would help you plan ahead. Finally, after, always good strategy to follow up within 48 hours. Definitely, absolutely send that email to the chair. Absolutely. If you can send a separate email to specifically, everybody you met, great. Don't expect a reply from everyone. Also, remember that if you did not get an opportunity to meet with somebody that you would have liked to connect with, whether it's to explore a collaboration or learn about some other facet, it's okay to email them after to say, I would love to reconnect with you or connect with you about some of these things. And also you can schedule follow-up conversations with faculty to learn more about the department, and other opportunities that you may not have had the opportunity to talk about. Take time after each interview. I recognize after the interview you might be really tired, but if maybe the next day when you are feeling a little more comfortable, take time to reflect through the experience. Ask yourself questions like, did you feel comfortable during the interview? Because even good hiring committees really want to make you feel comfortable and easy, and it goes both ways. They are also trying to communicate their culture as much as you are trying to communicate yours and learn from them. Did you like the answers they gave to your questions? What was generally the atmosphere and the vibe like? Were they collegial? Were they really easygoing and openly accessible and friendly in terms of responding and learning from you? Were there any specific red flags like we talked about, right? If they asked, there were a lot of inappropriate questions. If you felt like this environment wasn't particularly friendly to your specific multiple identities, those are things to think about during your reflection time. Were all the responsibilities that you might have as a faculty clear? If not, what are some clarifying questions you might ask during the meantime? How does it align with your priorities, and what are some rooms for negotiation? I'll get into the negotiation piece in a minute. Finally, do not overthink your performance. It's very natural right after the interview to kind of have that complete decline in confidence, saying you completely sucked and you blew it. But then, after a few hours, you might talk to your spouse, your colleague, your friend, and you'll hear them say that, no, this sounds great. And you end up feeling really great, for a little while. And then you think back again, no, I think it didn't go as well as I thought. It's okay. You went through a really stressful situation, surge of feelings and emotions and warped perspectives are natural to happen. Don't overthink that. Especially because if you have back-to-back interviews at other places, you don't want this, to really cloud how your other experiences go after. The other aspect, which is tricky, is waiting to hear back. Be patient. If they've given you a timeline, And with everything else going on right now in 2020, be a little more generous, give them extra couple more weeks before you reach out again. So if they gave you a deadline, at least, I would say not even a week. In today's climate, we wait a week and a half or 2 weeks, unless and until you have another pressing deadline to honor. Okay, so now let's move on to the negotiation part. I want to give a quick outline of how to think about the job offers and negotiation. As always, as much as you can, do your research before, learn about the different considerations and components that we talk about. While you're doing your research on the parallel, you might also want to think through what your ideal offer looks like. What do you really want from your faculty position? And to craft this, you would have to have an assessment of your vision. What is important for you? What is non-negotiable? The two categories of absolutely needed, non-negotiable versus what would be nice to have but negotiable. And that would inform your negotiation strategies, and I've listed some additional resources to help through that. Okay, so do your research. All the articles that I posted, College Navigator, that helps you with understanding the profile of the university. But this compensation survey link that Inside Higher Ed has is lists common databases for relevant information of salary and benefits. Because also, while you are looking at the data, question it as well, because you might look at employment data for faculty at UVA, but it's not going to tell you the different layers. What is the base salary? It's not consistent across all departments. Based on which school it might be under, the whole package and compensation might be different. Is there a minimum salary? And every employee range has minimum, median, and maximum. What is that range? How do you find out about it? This is not so much of a consideration for STEM people, but some teaching faculty or other faculty, non-tenure faculty might have 9-month contracts as well. And so keep in mind different facets of a salary and benefit package before you get into it. In terms of doing the research, it's easier for public university and state employees because that's publicly available information. You can look up different places to find that information up. What are typical starting salaries and how you get increments post tenure, etc. Again, are there any recent reviews or reports on salary equity? Even in Robert's session, I posted the 2014 NSF study on UVA, right? In terms of men versus women, their comparable salaries and stuff. So there are now more publicly available reports about equitable salaries for different faculty members. The Inside Candidate is also a good one to read, especially if you are going up against somebody who might be an internal candidate, how to structure yourself and your expectations. All right, so when we're talking about the ideal offer, and you have to ask yourself what is most important to you. And I've broken this up into 3 specific categories, okay? First is the compensation package. Let's talk money and benefits and where you need the support financially. One is definitely salary and benefits, your health insurance, your retirement plan, etc. So you want to evaluate those between different organizations that you're applying to or different offers that you have. What does the leave look like? Again, this is also important, right? Especially based on your specific circumstances. If you are planning to start a family or you already have children, you might want to have more flexibility. Same thing with some specific circumstances in your life. You might want to think through the tenure clock, or at least have an understanding or information about the tenure clock. Is there any flexibility of pausing the tenure clock for urgent situations in your life? What does the startup package look like? What are the different components of a startup package? And these are kind of things that you would discuss after the offer has been made, and you are talking to the chair and they are going to give you a breakup. Other responsibilities, the way that you have to think about is what would you be doing in the first few years of your faculty life, and how can you be set up so that you succeed? Your eye on the prize is tenure, right? So you're going up for tenure in 5-6 years or however long that is. how are you going to make through the milestones that are required to get the tenure? So which means you have to have a better understanding of what the tenure expectations are and how are you going to succeed through each of these milestones. So for example, teaching considerations, what does your load and schedule look like for teaching, in the first few years? What kind of courses you might be expected to teach, what you might be, how to develop those, what kind of support exists, especially in today's, what happened in 2020, faculty had to move really quickly towards course designing on Zoom. Thankfully, we have a really good Center for Teaching Excellence, which has done a phenomenal job of trying to give the accessible resources to support faculty in making the transition. So having those kind of support really helps. Even with your own teaching capabilities, if you don't have a lot of experience before, what are your professional development opportunities as a teacher and a researcher? Finally, in terms of administrative and departmental service, we don't think about that a lot, but like Chris said, Sarah said, Robert said, all three of them said they spend substantial amount of their time doing administrative and service work. And so how is that allocated? What part of it is measured or considered or expected as part of not just being a departmental colleague, but also as part of your tenure and promotion process? So like I said, one fundamental question that you have to constantly ask is, will I be productive and successful in this environment? And what are the important things that I would need to be successful? So multiple times, lab space, startup package, equipment list are something that you have to very intently and in detail think about. In terms of research, what other support exists? Are there core facilities? If you are going to work in a mouse lab or have other model organisms, what's going to be your strategy? Are you going to rely mostly on personnel? Are you going to do it internally? Is there a facility on campus that could help you with a specialized technique? Or are you going to outsource this outside or get specific cell lines or material from Jackson Labs or whatever other institute there is? What is your strategy and how much money would you need for each? So evaluate different scenarios and see how much money you might need. Talking to vendors really helps in making those assessments of how much equipments cost, how much some of these materials cost, so that you understand what you're getting into. Again, Robert got into this a lot, Sarah got into this. What is your strategy in terms of recruiting graduate students? While you are a new faculty, postdocs may or may not come right away, right? But you have to have a plan for getting a momentous start on your research plans. So how are you going to handle managing or recruiting people to do the research with you? And like I said, are there other support systems for if you need a lot of help in computational work, data analysis? Where are you going to get that? Are there opportunities for collaborators right away where you could, the burden is not completely on you? And then of course, life and thinking about cost of living in a university, especially if it's in a big city like New York or San Francisco. What does the cost of living look like? How is the salary benefits adjusted to that cost of living? Do they give you any moving allowance? Are there faculty housing options? Will they help support your house hunting options? In general, if you care a lot about the prestige of the department, the research organization, and in your field about that organization, how does that weigh into your assessment? And finally, if you have spouses and partners who are willing to uproot their lives and professions and move with you for your faculty aspirations, what support they might get in the first few months to settle down. While you are assessing your vision, whether you come up with a draft of your priorities, but get other eyes on it. Look at it with your mentor, let them help you think through if there is anything missing, which is key for success in this research plan from your priority list. Which elements are most likely to help you become successful in the first 3 to 5 years? Which elements might be nice to have, but are, okay, you would be fine without in the first few years, and which are absolutely not negotiable and you will absolutely need it to succeed. So this, get mentors to help you. That would also help getting understanding of the university. If you can talk to other people, alums, or any insider in the university to get an impression of what is reasonable to expect. This is a tricky one. You may not always have that information, but at least you can talk to, colleagues in a similar university to see, or in a similar city to see what are, reasonable ranges of things to expect. Quick resources for dual career options, especially in big cities, they have consortium, but the HERC has a whole dual career search website. The trick here is, if your partner is also looking for a faculty position and you run into the two-body problem, there are specific universities that have dual career offices that would be helpful, but you might need to spend a lot more time strategizing about it. And so I just listed as many different information on this slide, as well as put it on the resources slide. I won't have a lot of time to talk about it, but my colleague, Caroline Kalantari, who is in the dual career office at UVA, you can reach out to her and find out more about, similar support systems in other universities. All right, so finally, I want to leave you with one strategy when you are thinking about your negotiation. This is called, no matter what kind of a job offer you are evaluating, always have a BATNA. BATNA stands for best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So you will have your ideal, negotiation expectation, a proposal, and the chair will give you a proposal, and you'll probably match it somewhere in the middle. While you're giving your ideal proposal, also have an assessment of what the alternate middle ground would be, right? What is the best option for you in a middle ground? What 60% or what percent of your asks you are reasonably okay with having? So that's called best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So approach the negotiation process as collaborative, and I cannot say this enough. It's not just your incentive, it's the faculty hiring committee's incentive to get you on board if they've made you an offer. Just having a bit of an understanding from the other side of it, I can see how much work goes into posting a hiring position, recruiting people, interviewing people, and then finding somebody who really matches the criteria. A lot of times people don't, the committees are not satisfied with the candidates and they reopen searches. But if they actually found somebody and they made an offer, they will try to get you as onboarded as much as possible and you work with you. So you want to also give off a professional and diplomatic and collaborative vibe while you're going through the negotiation process, because you have to keep an eye on the long game. If you actually end up joining this university, they would be your colleagues. And so you don't want them to remember you through a bad experience. You want to start off with a good experience. So remember to be collaborative and have a professional demeanor through the whole thing. But also at the same time, have a sense for where your bargaining power is. What are reasonable things that you can easily get? Is this one among specific other offers that you have? If you have other offers, your bargaining power might increase, right? And so if you had a K-99, this is something Robert brought up I never thought about, that people with K-99s get more salaries than people without. And it doesn't make sense, but those are some bargaining powers. Is this likely to be the only offer that you have during this recruitment cycle? And how does that impact your bargaining power? This is something that you have to self-reflect beforehand and go with the understanding of how you're going to present your proposal. It takes a lot of different conversations, sometimes months, to get through this, so have patience. Every time, as long as you are getting some understanding, progress, and future directions through a conversation, that's a good thing. And through, like I said, you'll constantly reevaluate and have a sense for what are your priorities and what is your bottom line, where you probably cannot, start off without reasonably having those things. Finally reiterating that I added everything to the resources that would help you get started to do the research that you need. There are other books as well. One of them that really works for negotiation on everything, they give a lot of different strategies, is Getting to Yes. Finally, this doesn't happen too often, but if you actually hear all the terms over the phone, always politely ask for a written statement of it so you can evaluate it properly, and don't feel any urge to respond in the affirmative or negative. They're not expecting you to say anything. You can just hear it out and just say, I really appreciate you. Could you send it to me in a written versions for me to like look at it properly? All right, so this is it for our session today. Like I said, I've created a document inside the negotiation folder, and I've added all the links in it. I'll keep adding new links in it whenever I find out something more relevant for this, and would be helpful for you to have.